So who's telling the truth? Here to go one-on-one is Senator Gregg of New Hampshire, a leading Republican voice on financial issues. Good to see you, Senator.
John, thanks for having me. I love the Red Sox shirt.
Amen for that.
Is that Carl Yastrzemski?
That's Dustin.
Did you get that from Carl?
That's it. That was sent to me as a gift. This was the subject of tense but bipartisan negotiations for some time, this issue of financial reform. Everybody out there watching is affected by this.
Absolutely.
And now those talks have collapsed. You see the partisan mood at the moment. Some of your colleagues say this is all a hangover from health care, that health care got so partisan, forget it, we're not going to work with the Democrats now. Are we being that petty in Washington?
I hope not. We need to do this in a bipartisan way. This is extremely complex stuff. There really aren't a whole lot of partisan issues in this mix. But there's a lot of big issues, as you said. It affects everybody on Main Street. And we can do it in a bipartisan way. In fact, we were very close to agreements on things like too big to fail. We were very close on agreements on derivatives, very complex issue. Right. Very close on agreements on systemic risk.
So what's the barrier to agreement? And let me ask you as you do so. The House Republican leader put out a statement tonight saying the Democratic proposals guarantee, quote, open-ended bailouts. Is that a fair statement? I know you disagree with some of the particulars, but is that a fair statement? Senator Dodd's bill in the Senate does have the shutdown plans, does create a mechanism to shut down firms if they get out of control, the so-called funeral plans. Right. They would have to put up money. Is it fair to say the Democrats want open-ended bailouts, or is that hyperbole?
That's a touch over the top. But they do have the problem that they have created an atmosphere, and the bill does not kill the atmosphere where too big to fail still exists, because it gives the Treasury and FDIC the ability to come in a bank that's overextended itself, or financial institutions that's got systemic risk, and allow that entity to be continued as it tries to work out the problems. The proposal, which was bipartisan, which was led by Senator Corker and Senator Warner, and which I strongly support, didn't allow that to occur. Unfortunately, that's been put on the shelf. That basically said to a financial institution that wasn't making it, you're done. Your stockholders are wiped out, your unsecured bondholders are wiped out. You go basically straight to a form of bankruptcy, which is what we should do, because the markets can't have a concept that somebody can exist even though they're financially insolvent. That undermines basically the efficient use of capital. You do not want that to happen. We have to end too big to fail. And on our side of the aisle, we're totally committed to that. And I think the other side of the aisle is too. They just haven't gotten there yet. We've got a better idea. Their idea doesn't get there.
Well, I want to get to some of the specifics because, again, this is important. It affects every single American watching us. But it is caught up right now in the politics. And here's what the Democrats are saying, that these negotiations were ongoing. There were some differences, but progress was being made. And then what their take on this is that in this political environment, that Mitch McConnell, your leader, Senator Cornyn, the head of the Republican Senatorial Committee, went up to Wall Street, met with hedge fund leaders, and said, you know what, we're on your side on this issue. Give big to the Republicans. That is the narrative coming from the Democrats right now.
Well, you know, that's a little over the top, to say the least, too. I mean, the simple fact is we were willing to reach an understanding. I think the pullback here occurs as a result of a lot of different factors, but primarily it is that politics versus substance has taken the forefront. But I think it's coming from both sides of the aisle. I would say that the White House has been extremely populist on this issue recently. Now, originally they had proposals which made a lot of sense, and in fact they actually signed on to some of the proposals which were out there that had been reaching a bipartisan effort. And then they backed up about 3 weeks ago and said, no, we're going a more populist route. Well, populism has great jingo phrases. You know, it makes people feel good to beat up on Wall Street. But in the end, if you undermine the financial institutions that create the loans, that make the small business person able to hire people, it cuts off our nose to spite our face. And that's what happens here when you take a populist approach.
So then help me out. A common sense conservative from the state of New Hampshire, a guy who almost became a cabinet secretary in the Obama administration at the beginning before you had second thoughts about that. The guy who was the lead Republican negotiator in creating the TARP program back in the Bush administration. Right. You have been involved in this. You have a history of reaching across the aisle. You also have a history of being a pretty fierce partisan when you choose to be too. Where's the circuit breaker here? Not for who wins in Washington, but for the people watching at home who are saying all this time after the collapse, all this time after September 2008, and all this time of watching their 401ks go this way and just starting maybe to come back to that point, why has the Congress and the president still done nothing on the big issues?
Well, first off, I don't want to be too supportive of the administration here. I'm happy to be. I'm just kidding. A lot has been done. The simple fact is that the financial industry was stabilized. We were facing a calamity, a catastrophic event, an implosion of our entire financial industry, not only on Wall Street, but on Main Street. And it would have had a massive effect on our economy. And the recession we went through would have looked like small potatoes, even though it's been very harsh compared to what potentially would have been a depression-type event. And we stabilized the financial industry, and now we've gotten the money back, from the banks at least. We're not going to get it back from the auto deals. We have interest. So the taxpayers have actually made a fair amount of money here, and that's taken a lot of time to work through. And a precipitous action to try to address this would have probably produced the wrong results. We had to take a look and see what really happened, figure it out, and try to adjust. Now, there are 4 basic areas where we're trying to make corrections, and they're all fairly complex, but none of them, in my opinion, require a partisan response.
So then why does your leader say today, I would recommend Republicans to vote no? Why doesn't everybody button it up and try to go back in the room and fix it?
You know, because the bill that came out of the Banking Committee was partisan. I mean, it did not include the core elements of a really good, constructive, bipartisan bill. Why don't we button it up and go back in the room? That would be my suggestion. Why doesn't the White House call a little bit of a conference here, quietly, bring down the key players, you know, Senator Shelby, Senator Dodd, a couple of the other folks who understand what they're doing on these very complex issues, sit them in a room, sit them around the table and say, okay, we're going to stay here until we get it done. That's what we do with TARP, and it worked. And I think we could do it now if we wanted to, but right now, unfortunately, the administration is pursuing this, we want a political win, I think, as versus we want a substantive win, and that's just my view.
You are unique, not totally unique, but special in the idea that you're not running for re-election. So this is your last year, which I assume gives you the freedom, is this correct, to just maybe be a little bit more honest, a little bit more...
Well, you like to think you were anyway,
yeah.
But there's no question. There's a certain relief from the day-to-day necessity of nuancing things. You just basically... I was not much of a nuancer anyway. But.
3rd term in the Senate, came here in 1992, lived through the polarization of the Clinton days, the polarization of the Bush days. Candidate Obama said Washington was going to be a very different place. I'm not assigning any blame. I think it's probably shared on both parties, but it's not. Washington's not a very different place. Why?
I think there are a lot of factors, but if I were to pick the number 1 factor, I believe it's a polarization that's the result of, I hate to say this, a 24/7 news cycle where hyperbole is the watchword of the day. And as a result, instead of having substantive, thoughtful discussions, everybody's trying to get the one-liner that gets them on the news or that makes them, or that creates an event that's coverable. And because the news cycle is such that everybody who's doing the news has to basically create attention, you don't get the in-depth sort of substantive thought process or analytical process that you used to have. Now, that may be just a perception we have because we live today. If you go back and you read what was happened during Lincoln's day, I mean, the vitriol was much worse than ours. I just completed a book on Andrew Jackson, and the vitriol was incredible. I mean, the Senate even censured him. Never happened before, never happened since. So maybe it's just that in this moment in time, we think it's worse than any other time, but maybe it really isn't. Maybe it's just the character of the institutions.
What is possible in the rest of this year, midterm election year, where everybody's pretty much already gone into their camps, everyone's thinking about raising money. We're going to have a Supreme Court nomination, for example. Do you expect partisan Armageddon there, or do you think the president's going to bring Republicans down to the White House, try to have a little meeting of the minds, maybe some sharing of information beforehand? Might that be an exception to the current climate?
I would hope so. I mean, there's certainly a lot of good people out there that he could nominate that wouldn't necessarily be of my philosophy, but who I'd vote for. I voted for Judge Sotomayor, for example. But as a very practical matter, it's going to depend on who he decides to nominate and how he decides to vet that person with members of the Senate before he moves the name forward, so that there's a feeling of inclusion as versus exclusion, which is very important.
There's a debate in your party. Some people say, especially in this midterm election year, it's not a national election, you're not pushing a presidential candidate or a big national agenda, that say it is safe to be the party of no because people are skeptical of the Obama administration. People are in a bad mood because of the economy. People maybe don't like some parts of the health care bill, which is part of the midterm election debate. Some people say just be the party of no. Your former speaker on the House side, Newt Gingrich, yet again today said this in a speech here in Washington: you can't govern by saying no. Imagine we won a huge victory. Imagine that John Boehner's the new speaker. He's the House Republican leader right now. Imagine that Mitch McConnell, your leader at the moment, is the new majority leader. What's their agenda? It can't just be yelling no. Does your party yell no too much right now?
Well, we do, and we need to, when we're confronting things that are very bad for our country, either fiscally or from a standpoint of policy. I do not want to see this country move down the road of Europeanization of our nation. And basically, you've got a government now that's moving to the left. I think the fundamental error that this administration
that far left, you came pretty close to joining this government.
Yes, I did, and that was my mistake. But all American politics is historically played between the 40-yard lines. But this administration came in with what was essentially supermajorities in the House and the Senate, and they decided to govern like a parliamentary system. And they went down to the 20-yard line or the 15-yard line on the left. And they've basically moved very aggressively out on an agenda which...
Did they earn that right with their supermajorities? They won big in 2006 and 2008.
Well,
they could make the argument, we won the elections.
They had the right to try it, but we also have the right and the responsibility to try to resist it. And I don't think the American people are there. America's a center-right government, center-right people. They want government, but they don't want it to be excessive. They want it to be affordable. And most importantly, what Americans want is to pass on to their next generation, their children, a country that's better, stronger, and more vibrant and more prosperous. But what we're looking at now, because of the debt that's being run up in this country, is that we're going to be the first generation to pass on to our kids a country that's less prosperous, where their standard of living goes down. That's not fair and it's not right, and it's really a function of excessive government, of government just simply growing too much and spending too much. And when you pass something like the health care bill, which is the single largest expansion of the government really, in my experience, and probably in the last 50 years. And you couple that with the nationalization of the student loan program. You couple that with the taking over the automobile industries. You couple that with very significant aggressive proposals in the area of just general spending on the discretionary non-defense side. You're seeing a government that's just growing beyond our capacity to pay for it. And our children are going to end up with a debt which is going to saddle them and make their lifestyles much less viable than ours as far as quality of life.
There is a different perspective, of course, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and in your Democratic colleagues in the Senate, but we will bring them in to give their perspective. On this site, we thank you for yours.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the time. I love the set.
I appreciate it. Thank you.